Hello and welcome everybody, and today we're doing a pretty fun episode. This is the Turtles Commander from the new Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles expansion from Magic the Gathering that I am the most excited to try in cEDH, and I figured we'd do a brewing episode today. Remember, if you like videos like this, make sure to hit that like button, that subscribe button, as they help out the channel a whole ton. We are trying to essentially break this commander for cEDH because I think this idea that you have a commander where you just cheat in a bunch of ridiculously powerful creatures and potentially even take out your opponents in one turn seems like a very funny and unique concept that we don't really get access to quite a whole ton in cEDH. So I said, hey, let's try this turtle commander out. We're gonna give it a little bit of a shot for brewing it and then kind of go from there, kind of walk through that thought process and what it takes to brew a commander like this, all that kind of stuff. Wrath and Mikey Troublemakers is a 7-mana 7/7 trample haste, right? So if you get your commander out and you go to combat, you get that trigger right away. It says when they attack, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a creature card. Put that card on the battlefield tapped and attacking, and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So essentially, as long as your deck is full of ridiculously large creatures, it will just cheat them into play and you'll be able to have them come in tapped and attacking. So my hope with this commander is that we can essentially fill this deck with just a bunch of things that say, whenever you deal combat damage, take another combat, right? And then you get another Wrath and Mikey trigger, and then et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So that's the hope. We'll see if it's even slightly possible. But I kind of like it. And it also creates this really unique and fun deck building restriction where it's like you can't play small creatures if you want the main game plan to be as consistent as possible. Now, one of the things you'll see right away when we look at this deck list is my first thing in the sideboard here is Treasonous Ogre, because I'm like, is it good enough? Because Treasonous Ogre is so messed up in a deck like this. Is this Treasonous Ogre good enough that I'm willing to whiff a percentage of the time is essentially the question we are asking ourselves. But that's something we'll have to find out as we continue to brew through this deck. So before we get any farther into this video, I want to shout out our friends over at Voidmonster, for we have a brand new drop going on right now. Now, if y'all remember the first time we had Voidmonster on the channel, we had their Devoid drop, which was an amazing collection of Eldrazi inspired art, all done by Forrest Imel, the owner and creator of Voidmonster. Now, this time around, we're going to be doing some really cool stuff with their brand new red drop. Every single month there is a brand new drop of exclusive TCG inspired accessories and apparel over on Voidmonster, and if you use the link down in the description below, you can let them know not only do you appreciate this brand new collection, but you're interested in supporting our channel here at Comedian MTG as well. Voidmonster has been awesome to partner with and work with, and they make some genuinely beautiful products. So if you're interested in checking out the brand new red collection, check out voidmonster.org either in the description of this video or in the pinned comment. First thing I'm going to do right away is just add my cEDH fast mana package. I really got to update this to get rid of these two. But that's one thing we're going to have to do right away. And once again, we can't use any of that normal creature ramp, right? So that's going to be something really interesting as far as deck building restrictions are concerned. I think Lion's Eye Diamond makes a ton of sense in a deck like this because, hypothetically speaking, we don't care about our hand. We only care about getting that one trigger from our commander. So heck, might as well throw it all away. And what's interesting about this deck compared to a deck like a Tali is that, you know, at the end of the day, we are not casting a bunch of spells, right? Essentially, if we get our commanders down and go to combat, we're hopefully going to be able to just start taking our opponents out. So one of the first things I'm going to be doing is looking for creatures in these commanders that say, take an extra combat, right? All right, so this is a bunch of creatures that are able to get us an extra combat, and it seems that we only have 24 results pulled from this result, so that might be a little bit concerning for sure, and it is good to know that that is going to be potentially something that can be a bit of a problem. I know definitely right away one of my first picks here is going to be Port Razor, right? When it deals combat damage to a player, untap each creature you control. After this combat, there's an additional combat phase, and it can't attack a player. It's already attacked this turn. But hypothetically speaking, if 3 players are wide open, bang, 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 you get an extra combat per each, right? That's going to allow this commander to start to scale pretty aggressively. There's also the Raphael Tag Team Tough from the new Turtles set. I believe this is one of the party box precon sets is where we get this one. So that's already, hey, extra combat. The first time you deal combat damage to a player for the first time each turn, you can untap all creatures, you get extra combat, right? And an extra combat stack, which is really nice, thank goodness. But what is notable too about some of these is that Yes, the extra combats may stack, but there are situations in which the untap part of it won't stack, right? So you might have an extra combat where all of your creatures haven't had the ability to untap, which can be a bit of a pain. This Scourge of the Throne is going to be an interesting one. Sadly, it's an attack trigger. So when it attacks for the first time each turn, if it's attacking a player with the most life total, you're able to untap, get an extra combat. It might be worth bringing in just in case you go into a scenario in which you can like already have maybe one of these other extra combat enablers going. And then by the time you go through that combat, the problem is that none of these creatures will have haste, so that methodology and that line of thinking might not work out as well, but I'll at least throw some like that into the sideboard. It is also worth noting that, yeah, any of these that don't have haste are not going to be able to give you an extra combat when you go through that process, right? And notably, a bunch of these are not combat damage triggers, which is a little bit tough. A bunch of these are attack triggers, right? So that can be a little bit more difficult to potentially make something work. I wonder if Ansrag is going to be worth it. When it becomes blocked, untap each creature you control after this combat. Yeah, but there's not really a lot of ways to force a block if we're not building around Ansrag particularly. So that is kind of worth noting too. So what I am noticing is that because of this combat damage thing, it's not like, I'm a little bit skeptical about the idea of us being able to essentially chain through combats just through one iteration of this commander. Now that being said, we can potentially make some interesting stuff happen, so I'm not going to be hyper skeptical about it quite yet. I think Morog is kind of interesting because there's a reality in which if you can save your land drop, you can then suddenly earn some extra combats there and get that landfall trigger, which is kind of cute. So I think there might be some interesting stuff that you can do with Morog for sure. I think that the good leads into some interesting stuff there. There's also the Hellkite charger trigger, but unfortunately that is one that needs to come in afterwards. That's an attack trigger for that card. It's an attack trigger for Godo as well, although Godo Helm is like not a crazy thing to have in this deck, so I might sideboard that as well. The same thing is going to come out for FOMO plus Rionia as well, right? If you can get an early FOMO down in this deck, yeah, it kind of sucks to like flip into a FOMO off of your commander, right? But at the same time, there's a very interesting reality in which you go, okay, cool, like flip into FOMO, have Rionia out, et cetera, continue, see what happens from there, right? Combat Celebrant's another one to consider, but yeah, definitely a little bit lower on some of these attack damage triggers. Or a bit lower on these damage equals extra combat triggers, right? We do have a number of these things that say like, all right, damage equals something interesting happening, right? But there's a lot of attack triggers when it comes to these extra combat things, right? So a number of these we kind of have to put in the considering and sideboard for right now because it doesn't quite indicate that we can like chain combats together, which is a bit of a bummer, but that's okay. Let's look at some additional combat effects that are not tied to creatures as well. And these we can definitely look into making combos. Things like Breath of Fury, Aggravated Assault, stuff like that can definitely end with some combo implications here in the deck as well. In the meantime, I'm going to put all of these in the sideboard and just allow us to have these cards as options because any sort of extra combat turns into a real boon for this deck. So whatever the end result might be can be kind of interesting. Even Seize the Day is kind of fun because in this deck, you really only need to be attacking with your commander. And so there's some interesting stuff that can really come from all of these extra combat effects. And unlike other decks, there's no weird timing restrictions with these extra combats, right? So they end up being pretty impactful right away as you get them. Gotta shout out Tales of Adventure Magic. TotalMagic.com is one of the partners here on the channel, and they consistently have amazing selection of Magic singles for your needs. If you need anything, whether it be reserve list card, old school foils, any cards that are hot and on regular buy lists, you're gonna find them at TotalMagic.com. Use code comedian, you can get 5% off your order today. Now, knowing that this deck really won't be able to turn into an immediate like one turn kill effect because of the fact that there's not a high enough redundancy of these extra combat effects, I feel pretty confident in saying that we can play a card like Treasonous Ogre to get our commander out a little bit early, just because that value that we get out of a card like this will definitely be worth it to get our commander out early to start flipping in some really high value creatures and stuff like that. And then the rest of the deck, I want to fill in with creatures that are just going to provide us sort of a ridiculous amount of value, right? I think one of the first ones that comes to mind is like Old Gnawbone. And what I like about Old Gnawbone is that if you do have something like an Aggravated Assault out, that does just turn into infinite combats with your commander because you're dealing combat damage. And even if, you know, you don't get haste on something like Old Gnawbone, if your Wrath is able to connect over and over again and at least get you 5 damage on each of your opponents, you're able to chain infinite combat. So I feel like this deck is almost always going to just turn into an Aggravated Assault style deck, no matter what of the other effects we are trying to put into this deck list. This deck also feels like it might be a sneak attack deck potentially, just because sneak attack is one of those cards that says like if our commander is not quite doing what it needs to be, or if we get a bunch of these Gruul cards stuck in our hand, maybe it's a way for us to potentially get some of these cards out, cheated in for some pretty decent value. I might even just be confident enough to put that in the main deck for the way this deck is already shaping out to look like. One thing I definitely don't want to skip on is ramp, right? So I want to be looking at as many ways as we can to ramp out our commander, right? So looking at things like Grim Monolith, I might even put in a Manifold Key to get a few untaps available for stuff like that. One of my things I'm thinking right away is that like, hey, we need to buy some amount of time for ourselves as well. So cards like Blood Moon are things that I'm thinking about pretty frequently. I'm also a little worried about things like Grafdigger's Cage, right? So that might be a card that I'm considering. Oh, these are all going to the sideboard, aren't they? Yep. Yeah, I'm worried about things like Grafdigger's Cage. So I do want to sort of bake in a few main deck answers for cards like that. So thinking of things like Force of Vigor, and then obviously we'll have Boseiju in the lands. In the meantime, I'm just going to put 30, let's just say like 31 mountains, because it is sort of a big mana deck, so there is a world in which we actually want more lands than the average cEDH deck at this point. So in the meantime, we'll sort of keep that as sort of a placeholder, but definitely going to be thinking about, you know, with Boseiju and Force of Vigor, a few other cards like that, how much we're going to be able to pressure cards that essentially shut down our commander right away. Another card that I'm thinking about for this type of thing is Emerald Charm, right? Makes for really solid untaps if we are untapping our Grim Monolith or any sort of acceleration pieces that allow us to move a little bit faster as we're going through that process, and then also could blow up some things like some problematic enchantments out of our opponent's decks, which is nice. Carpet of Flower is a nice way to ramp without mana dorks. Same thing is going to go for Utopia Sprawl and for Wild Growth as well. This is going to be a deck where we are going to want a decent amount of artifact ramp, right? So I think we're going to turn to effects like Arcane Signet, Belwar Stone, or Talisman. I also want to think about some other high value permanents and or creatures that we're going to be flipping in from the top of our library, right? We don't want to be just flipping in things that essentially would mitigate the reason we'd be playing a commander like this, right? We do want to have a pretty decent amount of payoffs available. One of the things I really like is one of the O'Hares from the O'Hare, I believe it's O'Hare Calcium, right? Deepest Growth. Yeah. Which, let's make it a little more legible here. But anyways, it whenever it deals combat damage to a player, reveal that many cards from the top of your library. You can put a creature and or land card from among them onto the battlefield, put the rest in the bottom of the library in a random order. So immediately you're potentially getting more triggers off of your commander, all that kind of stuff, able to go and provide a lot of value in that capacity. I also kind of like the idea of a Peter Parker's Camera in this deck because we are, our commander's ability is getting our commander down for 7 mana is quite a lot, right? But a Peter Parker's Camera can come down and then get us a copy of that attack ability for a really cheap premium here at 2 generic mana. So I definitely do not dislike having an option like that as well. As I mentioned beforehand, I'm kind of in the camp that we should probably play something like Rionia because it can not only do some interesting stuff with a lot of these value creatures, right? Unfortunately, a lot of them are legends, but then if you start reunioning things like Portraiser and Bloodthirster right away, you kind of can really start ripping a bunch of combats. And potentially if you can connect with your opponents, the token copies of these cards don't have the same restrictions about who they can and can't attack because they are new versions of these cards, right? So like Reunion and Bloodthirster suddenly would be able to go infinite. And I don't think you even need to necessarily play something like Fear of Missing Out quite as much. I am getting more and more interested in playing Combat Celebrant, even though it is like a 4/1 that doesn't immediately come in and have the ability to exert. I think there are realities in which you can jam a Combat Celebrant somewhat early, right before you play your actual commander, and then get into some really juicy stuff there. So that one's probably hitting the main deck for the time being, and so is our Morog. Scourge of the Throne is also super close for me. So when it attacks first time each turn, if it's attacking player with the most life total, you untap and you get an extra combat. That is really attractive, but it is one of those things where you essentially have to put it onto the battlefield and then reveal to your opponents exactly what your strategy is going to be. Not that they're really going to be confused by this deck and what it's doing. Also worth noting, we need to be playing some of these red rituals that we know and associate with these colors, minus the ones that are on creature bodies, right? So I'm thinking of things like Rite of Flame, Desperate Ritual, Pyretic Ritual. We're looking at Seething Song. We are looking at Geosurge. A lot of cards that you might be associated with a classic Atali plan, if that is a deck you're familiar with, which is pretty interesting here. A lot of these rituals can definitely Oh, Geosurge is sorcery only. Got it. Okay, cool. Jessica as well is another one. Obviously, we see quite a lot in cEDH, and I think it works pretty well in a deck like this, which is really cool. Want to remind everybody that the Kraken's Cup is an upcoming cEDH tournament. It's a 20K that is going to be in the Outer Banks, North Carolina. It's got a really cool group behind the event, and it's going to be in Nag's Head, which I've been told the scene out there is absolutely gorgeous. I've been down in the South for a couple events lately, and honestly, it's been super awesome. And this event has some really awesome scaling prizes, and you can win potentially really a solid amount of money going to this cEDH tournament. I'm very excited to be heading down there. As I mentioned, it's supposed to be a really beautiful area of North Carolina, and I'm super excited to sign up and compete with a lot of folks who are in the area. If you're interested in the Kraken's Cup or any of the other tournaments that we mention in the course of this video, you can check those down in the description down below. Very excited for the Kraken's Cup. We've got a couple awesome artists and guests and things like that, like myself, who are going to be showing up, and it's going to be a really sweet time. I kind of want to do a combat damage advanced search here. So let's just have whenever combat damage. So that's essentially looking for specifically combat damage related triggers that might be worth it for a deck like this. And then we'll sort of filter it by EDH rec rank, because we want to have, some of the more premium stuff that we're looking for here, as opposed to, any sort of draft common or something like that has that effect. Okay, so we see things like Professional Facebreaker, Ragavan, stuff like that, right? These are all great cards, and it makes sense why they would show up in a place like this, but I feel like these are maybe a little bit small ball. I think, we're talking about like Ancient Copper Dragon seems really interesting. You're rolling a d20 every time you're dealing combat damage to your opponent. Feels like a pretty solid place to me. Atali makes a lot of sense there. This is probably... potentially, it's maybe an Atali deck. I feel like we'll sideboard it for the time being. I think for a cool factor, Atali definitely makes it. Feels like what Hellkite Tyrant is too. I don't necessarily know that it's the correct option, but it's definitely higher up on the cool factor for some of these triggers. Definitely also should have narrowed this down to just creatures. I don't hate Balefire Dragon. A board wipe on a stick is not too bad to think about. Cavern Horde Dragon, it makes treasures equal to your opponent's amount of artifacts that they control. Yeah, let me narrow this search down to just creatures, because or else we'll be here for 1,000 years. Alrighty, cool. Let's see, what else are we looking at here? There is the Quartzwood Crasher, which with your commander does get kind of out of hand really quickly. It says whenever one or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, create an XX Dinosaur Beast token with Trample, where X is the amount of damage those creatures dealt to that player. So because your commander and the Quartzwood Crasher both have Trample, you can have the Crasher come in attacking a different player. And essentially, you'll have a situation where you connect him with your commander, probably make a 7 toughness dinosaur, and then have the Crasher hit a different player and make a 6 toughness dinosaur. All of these with Trample, meaning if you have extra combats or if you have any other way to, essentially take an extra turn, something like that, these would get out of hand relatively quickly. So I kind of am in the camp of, maybe a little bit cute, but it also just might be worth it. So I'll definitely throw that in the sideboard and really heavily consider it moving forward. We're probably also going to think about some crazy stuff for this deck, like a Blightsteel Colossus, all that kind of stuff. Every creature just comment or turn, but that many 1/1 guy. Yeah, it's considerable. Obviously, the Ancient Bronze Dragon's pretty funny. Put X1/1 counters on each up to 2 target creatures, which X is the result. That one's kind of interesting and a little bit comedic. Make a treasure token, not too worried about something like that. Questing Beast, sure, nothing there. Dragon Mage gives you a fresh wheel, which is fun, but once again, not something I'm super high on prioritizing here. Slicer is pretty funny. It does add a real clock to a game like this, but I'm not sure that's exactly where we want to be going with the deck like this. Pure Beats is going to be kind of the game plan for a deck, but I don't necessarily know that you want to do the whole Slicer Alexios thing, but it's worth at least taking to think about for sure. Now, Ruric Thar is a card I'm very interested in cheating in, and in fact, so we actually deal with this bit of awkwardness, right? So the awkwardness becomes we are already going to be low on non-giant payoff creatures in this deck, because we have to deal with the fact that we are playing a deck that wants to only flip giant creatures off the top, right? So if we stick a Ruric Thar, yes, it will most likely slow our opponents down pretty aggressively, but it also means that as long as we are doing anything other than our central game plan, which is just attacking with our commander over and over, it does mean that we are going to be doming ourselves for a lot of damage. That being said, I still think this is 100% worth it. Now I'm going to do a separate search, which is just the most popular cards with higher than 4 mana value, because I think that's exactly the kind of thing that we are trying to cheat into play. Sadly, that's an attack trigger, so we'll skip the Atali Primal Surge, but that one's pretty dang funny. Craterhoof Behemoth, honestly, probably just worth it. To TBH, probably just worth it, even if you only have a couple creatures out. This just comes in and pumps your entire team and slams someone for like 30-ish damage. Kind of worth it in my eyes, for sure. Terror of the Peaks is pretty dang close for me, but we'll see about that one in particular. Disciple of Freyalise is definitely worth considering, but maybe a bit more of a whiff than we might like it to be. Atali, as we mentioned, the sideboard there is always kind of fun and interesting. Some of these other cards do provide a pretty decent amount of value, but we really want to be narrowing down to the things that are going to be extremely high value. Twin Flame Tyrant honestly might be good enough. Just doubling all of your damage for the rest of the game is pretty dang sweet. Sadly, a bunch of these Eldrazi are all cast triggers. That one's a bit of null and void there. Honestly, how do we feel about a Blightsteel Colossus? It's probably honestly just good enough. Like it seems so silly and so goofy, but I think genuinely cheating in a Blightsteel Colossus is just good enough at this point. Kogla's kind of a fun one. That one might be worth considering. Neheb definitely should be worth considering if we're going to go for any sort of aggravated assault plan. This one being able to connect with your opponents and make a bunch of red mana seems like a really easy way to just go infinite out of nowhere. Now, the thing with Aggravated Assault to keep in mind as we sort of talk about some of these giant payoffs is the fact that Aggravated Assault is not something we can really easily tutor in Gruul, right? So that is definitely worth keeping in mind that enchantments are pretty out of the Gruul color pie as far as tutoring is concerned, outside of a card like Gamble, for example. And this is a deck we're going to be chucking our hand quite a lot, so who's to say if Gamble even would have the ability to pay off quite as well. As we go through here, we really want to avoid those triggers that are going to be as they attack triggers, because those are going to be a little bit rough because we are not going to necessarily have the ability to get those attack triggers. Some of them are probably going to be worth it, as we mentioned with a few of those extra combat cards, but definitely worth noting here. Now, Savage Mintmaw is a little bit awkward because you kind of want to have a card like this that has that attack trigger for things like Aggravated Assault, but I do genuinely think it not being able to get that off the immediate time you flip into it is definitely pretty rough. We probably are close to a Void Winnower deck. Something like that is definitely really interesting to have access to. Platinum Angel is worth considering. I don't know if it's good, but it's worth considering. Vorinclex is worth considering. I don't know if these are too silly. Is 13 damage from an Emrakul worth considering? It's worth a think, for sure worth a think. Summit Bahamut is also probably worth a think. The Tyrant is probably worth a think. A lot of these cards are definitely worth considering, but it really begs the question of like how many of them are going to be 100%, oh god, we got to get this in our deck right away. Cloth, another one of these effects that cares about when it attacks, adding a bunch of mana, which would be great, but unfortunately not what the deck is trying to do. Dragonhawk adds a real clock to the table, TBH. It is an enter or a tax trigger, so you will get an enters trigger from it, and hopefully if everything in this deck is going correctly, you will have a lot of cards to proc Dragonhawk's ability, which means you'll probably end up adding a pretty sizable amount of damage kind of out of nowhere if you do flip in a Dragonhawk. So I'm kind of a big Dragonhawk fan, and I think that might have a space in this deck, which is pretty dang cool, in my opinion. Is there any way this is a Protean Hulk deck? I don't think so, but I think that's very funny. I think that's really funny, but I don't think it's good. I can't imagine we get to the point where we want to play something like Giant Adaphage, but that is very silly. These Eldrazi's all being cast triggers is definitely a little heartbreaking for sure. Also want to shout out the Natural 20 Shamrock Showdown, a 7K cEDH event, which I'm actually going to be a special guest at, which is a new addition to the roster here, which I'm very excited. Halfway through March 15th, this is going to be a super sweet event in Nevada. Come check out the details of this event. It looks super, super awesome, and it'll be really cool to head out towards Nevada and check out that area. The Shamrock Showdown folks were super easy and super awesome to work with, so I'm very excited to jump down to that event and see all that's in store. Feel free to check out the description for details on this event too. Yeah, I wonder if cards like Courser Recruiter end up being something that's worth considering. I'm assuming most likely not, but it is definitely an interesting sort of card here that these untap and take a permanent of your opponent's type effects, right? Things like Zealous Conscripts. Now, if we were doing more cheeky stuff, I feel like that would be 100% a slam dunk, but we're not necessarily doing so. Fiendish Duo, definitely worth considering for the same reason our Tyrant is worth considering in the deck. Just doubling all of our damage seems like it's something that could get out of hand relatively quickly. Last Furnace Hellkite's also another one where it's like, yeah, I mean, the giving all of the things that attack your opponent's double strike is definitely not the worst, and could be into that for sure. The nice part is a static effect, not an attack trigger too. Oh, Wolfgar is so cool. It would double up our commander's attack trigger abilities there, which is pretty sweet, but there's no way to like get it in after the trigger. So it is definitely worth considering in the deck in general, because if you can curve your commander into this, obviously it gets pretty insane to get multiple triggers off of your commander as well. It's also worth considering some control pieces in the deck like Thorn Mammoth, or there's the Apex Allosaur as well, which are sometimes like one-sided board wipes, but obviously not super great if your opponents don't have their board set up. So, that one might be more of a meta call for sure. I think we start to get to a point where we're looking at cards like this where the card quality does diminish somewhat appropriately as time goes on, but it's still worth to look and explore and see if there's any more of these big payoffs that can really start to change the way we view the deck, or give us potential lines that we might not have seen previously. However, now we're sort of getting to the point where it's like, okay, here's some generically powerful cards, but I don't necessarily know that they're giving us what we need to sort of match that power level that we come to know and expect from a cEDH environment. All right, so if we go back to our main deck list, what do we have 100% locked in as of right now? So we have these extra combat creatures and some of the payoffs that are associated with them. Some of these cards that we definitely want to lock in as far as top end is concerned. I'm really going to have to change this printing because I do not know. Let's just associate with a regular Blightsteel Colossus to make things a little bit easier. All right, cool. So now we kind of go back to this ramp package. How many creatures do we have at the current moment? We're looking at 16 creatures that are pretty good payoffs to be ripped off the top of our library. I do have a feeling towards the end of which we would be messing with this deck that we want maybe a few more here, but let's go into sort of these packages and talk about some other things that can happen, right? I definitely think we do want a few of these cast from hand extra combats, right? I think things like the Great Train Heist seem perfectly reasonable. Tap all creatures you control. If it's your combat, there's an additional combat phase. Plus, there's the other implications of buffing your creatures, dealing combat damage and making some treasures. That seems pretty sick there. Breath of Fury, I feel like, is best when you have a lot of token makers, which is kind of interesting there. So I don't necessarily think we have a ton of things right now that make tokens, which we don't have kind of at all. So it is worth noting that would be like sort of a sub strategy, like hasty tokens would lead to Breath of Fury combos being really, really nice. There's the free extra turn effect, which I think just kind of goes in Fury of the Horde. You have to exile 2 red cards from your hand. So if you crack like an LED or something, obviously that's not going to happen. But in most other circumstances, this can lead to some pretty interesting nonsense. As I mentioned, Godot is a card I'm considering pretty heavily, but at the same time, there's not many equipment that I'm like, oh my God, we have to have it. And this equipment's going to change the way the game works fundamentally, et cetera, et cetera. So I think for right now, we'll sort of keep it as is. And definitely considering pretty heavily some of these. I think the Quartz Witchcratcher, just building an army in a can over 1 or 2 combats is pretty nice. And then, which one of these becomes the most relevant? I do like Seize the Day. The flashback on it does make me feel like it can do some pretty nasty stuff. So definitely interested in that one as well. The Overpowering Assault being a 3 mana extra combat if our commander has dealt combat damage this turn seems pretty easy to be broken in a deck like this. I'm definitely struggling with Terror of the Peaks. I do like that it is removal for creatures as well as pressure and damage towards life totals, but that one I'll have to think about a little bit more. I really feel like we want at least one of these damage doublers. I like the Twin Flame Tyrant to start things off. Scourge of the Throne is one I'm debating really heavily on. You do have to wait an entire turn cycle for it to pay off, but at the same time, you're immediately getting extra combats when it does. So that part's pretty sweet there. Also heavily considering this Fiendish duo for the same purposes. We're just considering that. And I don't know, part of me also just says like, hell, let's just throw in the combat extra Atali and see what happens. And there's a solid chance we could, flip into some sort of ridiculous card if we do that. Although, once again, might be more under the cute category, which we are definitely trying to potentially avoid in a deck like this, unless these cute cards, because the deck's already doing arguably some pretty cute stuff here, right? We're just essentially giant Gruul Turbo Stompy. And so we want to, avoid as much of the low card quality as possible as we can in these colors, right? Double Strike thing feels pretty relevant to me as well. Obviously, a 9 mana spell is not one that we're hoping to rip over and over again, but I think it's pretty interesting there. The Vaultboard Tyrant's another one where it's like you get some pretty decent card draw as things go on, but it's not necessarily the most efficient piece in the entire world. So a lot of definitely very interesting choices when it comes to some of these pieces. Grim Reaper Sprint, one that I really am interested in. I think the idea that it could be, hypothetically speaking, a 2 mana extra combat's really powerful, but something does need to die if that's the case. I think it's worth trying to sort of pray for the high roll on that one. Oops, not sprint printing. We're just gonna try and put it in the deck for the time being. Oh my goodness, move. Thank you. and go from there. World at War is another one I'm kind of having a hard time not considering, just because, yeah, after the second main phase, there's an additional combat phase, and it has rebound, right? So this gives you 2 turns of extra combats, which could be potentially pretty interesting. Speaking of extra combats and extra turns, I do think I want to try maybe at least one Final Fortune style effect in a deck like this. Now, it's extremely risky to do these things, but I have a feeling if you have situations where you have like extra combats lined up, all that kind of stuff, there's a very plausible reality where you just go, all right, cool, rip into this extra turn. We're just going to go for it, right? And I do think it's not out of the realm of reality to potentially do that. I do think we do need some sort of effects here for this deck that are stopping our opponents casting things on our turns, right? So Vexing Bauble seems like an interesting one. I feel like we want some sort of defense grid style effect a little bit in this deck, but also, you know, it's one of those things where we really don't want to just be going around king making other players, right? I feel like a card like Hexing Sculpture feels like it would make a lot of sense defensively for a deck like this, but we go back to this understood reality here where we can't really play a ton of these small creatures without diluting the giant flip game plan of this deck, right? Which is definitely something to be concerned about, right? And giving our deck a little comparison to one of my more recent Atali lists, we definitely do see this ability for Atali to play like multiple copy effects and stuff like that, which we won't be able to have access to with this commander in particular. It is kind of interesting, the thought of like potentially doing something like a roaming throne in this deck just to double up on our commander's ability. That's one that I'm not quite sure isn't worth the cut. It might be just good enough to potentially be worth it. And so that is definitely worth considering. And the nice part about a deck like the one we are currently building is that we are building a deck that is, hypothetically, weak to our commander being removed and something like that. But at the same time, like if you just have enough mana to cheat in these giant creatures, it doesn't really necessarily matter that we were losing our commander, right? There's just a point in which you just start beating people with, giant dragons in the air and putting a real clock on the table. Now, I do think there's also ways to build this deck more defensively too, right? Like you could make it a little bit of a slower turtle plan and essentially play things like Damping Sphere and stuff like that, which I think is a relevant and potentially viable way to build this deck. But it definitely requires a little bit more investment into, essentially slowing the game plan down pretty significantly. So the question is the investment into blowing out your opponent's plan going to be worth what you potentially gain by playing a little bit of a faster plan with your own game plan, right? And that's not really going to be something we know until the deck is out and we can have significant testing on it and things like that. Definitely want to add a Mox Opal. I know that's one that I haven't yet added to the deck list, but it feels pretty free here. We're getting to the point where we have a pretty significant amount of artifacts. Also, definitely worth noting that Scroll Rack might be a really interesting consideration here for this deck list, because obviously if we get a bunch of these giant creatures stuck in our hand, it's nice to just tuck them before we go to combat with our commander's activated ability as well. Now I'm doing a comparison feature between that Atali list that I mentioned earlier, just to see, a couple of the cards that are different between these decks, and they are unique enough on their own to be different. But, putting in things like Tezzeret like this, potentially a Basalt Monolith, right? It is nice to be able to just add them to our deck list directly from our Atali list. And so it's a very convenient feature here on Moxfield, which I'm just happy to use to save ourselves a bit of time trying to essentially reinvent the wheel here, right? I do like things like Ruby Medallion. We got a lot of red cards in the deck, so that's a nice, easy way to reduce our mana value. And once again, we got to avoid all these creatures, right? Because these are things that are going to water down our main strategy. So we do lose some important things like Simeon, Elvish Spirit Guide, stuff like that. All of your 1 mana dorks, et cetera, right? So it does come at a very real cost. And it's the reason that we can't really one-for-one the comparison between these two decks, right? It definitely has things in between that we have to be very respectful of when it comes to the differences between these two strategies and things that we have to be powering through, right? Definitely want to add a few of these removal and interaction pieces, maybe not like Lightning Bolt per se, right? But like a Red Blast and a Pyroblast definitely feel extremely appropriate for a deck like this. I also don't hate playing a really cool piece like Pyrokinesis, which is a card I really, really enjoy in the modern metagame. Underworld Breach is a card that we definitely could be considering hypothetically in this deck if we have enough cards that, for example, like hit a player, right? We'd probably want to go into more of a Dragon Mage style build, right? With a bunch of creatures, say like hit a player, wheel, all that kind of stuff. Because then you could just rip a breach, throw a couple extra combats in, and then most likely win the game. And honestly, I think it might be worth considering Underworld Breach just to have that potential of like, all right, cool, play a breach, play an extra combat out of my graveyard, go again, right? Hypothetically speaking, that could yield some really interesting stuff. So I'm definitely open to that reality. We have things like Autumn's Veil, which I like. There's Veil of Summer here. somewhere that we'll definitely throw into our main deck as well, potentially a Noxious Revival, all that kind of stuff. Definitely want to add that Veil of Summer here for sure, just to get ourselves a little bit more extra value. And then we're also going to get some of these lands that we definitely want in the deck here, especially some of our acceleration lands like Gemstone, City of Traders, Ancient Tomb. Luckily, those are things that we can translate from one deck to the other, so we don't have to worry about too much crossover there in that department at the very least. And obviously, Cavern of Souls, a huge land to be added to this deck. We're not going to be doing any flash effects with Emergent Zone because why would we? In a deck that cares about being on its own turn with its own combat. Urza Saga feels pretty good in a deck that cares really just about ramping hyper aggressively. You know, if I essentially get 4 mana on my turn by ramping into a mana vault, I feel pretty good about that exchange as well. So that part's going to be pretty sweet for this deck list. Definitely want at least a couple basics too, just because we are playing around the fact that we are probably going to include our own Blood Moon as a way to try and slow our opponents down whatever way we can in a strategy like this that doesn't really have a lot of disruptive elements to it, right? So that'll be really nice there. All right, enough of the comparison between this and Etali. Now we're looking at about 94 cards right now for this early iteration of this deck list, and by far it is not perfect and is not what it will be towards the end of when we actually go to sleeve up this deck list. But as we mentioned, this is just an exercise in kind of getting behind that deck brewing philosophy and kind of getting an idea of like what we would do for a commander as sort of ridiculous as this one. Yeah, I think in the beginning I was definitely hoping there were a few more things that worked naturally with extra combats with this commander, because I think those obviously would present a higher threat level and stuff like that. So, you know, there is definitely that consideration that there are plausible realities where this deck is just maybe a little bit missing a few pieces, right? A few other cards like some of these creatures out here, right? Like one more Bloodthirster, one more Port Raiser, another Raphael Tag Team Tough, right? Those type of cards that deal combat damage against extra combat, those feel like pieces that we definitely want a higher redundancy of. And it's definitely notable to think about the fact that in the future, as more cards hypothetically come out, we want to be looking into potential cards that would be working with this commander, because at a certain level of redundancy, it does just get explicitly good to be looking at strategies like this, right? I didn't realize it had that last mode. I didn't even notice the Bahamut Mega Flare ability is like kind of messed up. I don't know that you'll get there in this deck, but a repeatable removal spell that also gives you some cards and then domes your opponents for what is going to be a lot of damage in a high mana value deck like this. This one might be worth exploring just as a potential consideration. And also, I don't hate the idea that it's also, removal spells repeatedly attached to one body. So that could be kind of interesting. And I think, we'll concede and throw in Etali for the early version of this deck list. I think that's going to be nice to have, especially for folks who are trying to try this commander out. I think, we want to play some of the big splashy stuff in the beginning just to see if it works. And then if it doesn't, great, we've learned a lesson and we won't have to do it again, right? But with enough pieces in the deck that could potentially do some interesting stuff with Etali, I think it might be worth considering. Obviously, in Ruach Thar and stuff like that are a little bit contradictory, but doesn't have to be that big of a deal. And I think that's in the meantime where we're going to leave this deck. There's only a couple more slots remaining, and those are probably going to get filled up with me going a little bit deeper onto a Scryfall deep dive to see other forms of acceleration that specifically do not have to relate to using creatures as your acceleration. Apart from that, this is going to be a deck that is going to be at the very least wildly interesting to see in person. So just for the meantime, we'll add a few more things like Worldly Tutor, because I think just being able to put a Treason Soaker on top of your deck is probably pretty valuable in a deck like this. We can try the Basalt Monolith out, because at the end of the day, if you invest 3 mana into it on one turn, that does get you to 7 mana right away. If you make your land drop the next turn. So I don't think that's anything to necessarily scoff at. And then maybe if we are going to have now Grim Monolith and Basalt Monolith and Mana Vault and Soul Ring as far as key payoffs, I think, potentially putting a Voltaic key in here as well could be kind of interesting. Although, we do have Tezzeret as another key effect, right? So we'll just see if a high redundancy of these types of effects makes it any cleaner. All right, let's try a hand or two and kind of see what comes of it. You know him, you love him. We got to shout out partner of the channel, Heavy Play. Heavy Play makes amazing deck boxes, dice trays, and more to keep your Magic collection safe. Heavy Play makes some amazing quality products, and I use Heavy Play no matter what event I'm headed to, because genuinely I believe in these products. Heavy Play makes amazing protection for your cards. The magnetic dice tray playmat system is something I get complimented on all the time when I'm out at events. I constantly have people being like, yo, those playmats are super cool with that magnetic lips. Where are they from? How did you get those? And I'm constantly shouting out Heavy Play Person because I genuinely believe in these products and I use them all the time for my own cEDH career, for my cEDH decks, etc. They are super convenient in a tournament setting, and the foldability, the convenience of having all of your things together magnetically attached is something that is so hard to compare to, and I can't really go back to using other systems because it's so compact and neat, and it keeps my cards safe. So check out heavyplay.com/comedian to get a percentage off your order today. So looking at a hand like this is a no lander, obviously, so we'll ship that away. All right, we have a situation here where this could be as early as a turn 1 commander, depending on if our opponents have 7 cards in hand, which is a gamble I think in a deck like this you 100% have to take, right? So let's hypothetically go from there. Oh wow, this is a very distinct possibility that this is a turn 1 with our commander, and actually probably want to use something like City of Traders here, right? So we have colorless floating going into here, 3 colorless floating. You're able to turn that into 1, 2, 3 colorless floating and a red mana, which then can go into 1, 2, becomes 2 colorless floating and 3 red mana. And at that point, Jessica's Will only needs to net you 2 mana. So essentially your opponent has to have at least 5 cards in hand, which is pretty plausible at this time to be able to get your commander out on turn 1. I think that's a very nice start that we'll definitely hope for sure. But let's clear our entire mana pool and hypothetically play a copy of our commander on turn 1 here. Once again, I think that's an insanely good hand. But let's do our first attack and see what we flip into. Okay, we hit the Treasonous Ogre. That is one of those things that we talked about earlier. But even then, that's actually not the end of the world because we have the Great Train Heist in our hand here. So actually, we can just go and pay 12 life to do the Great Train Heist ability here. So let's go and put ourselves to 28 in this goldfish here and take an extra combat after this one. Do another combat with our commander and then go in for an attack here and see what we flip into. Okay, we go and we hit O'Hare Caslem. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that percently right. All right, cool. So we flip into the O'Hare and then we're able to hit our opponents, and then we can look at the top 6 cards of our library. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And we're able to cheat in a card, probably put in this Summon Bahamut, and we're able to blow up somebody's hypothetical permanent on turn 1. And then going from there, go into our next turn, blow up another thing on our turn, and go into another combat with our commander. Plus, we have a card like Port Razor here. It does feel like maybe we do want some sort of haste effect for this deck, but that definitely is something pretty interesting here. So we can flip into our commander again. Sure, flip into a Natali, ironically, exile a Vexing Bauble, might as well do something like that. Then we can hit with our O'Hare, look at the top 6, drop a Void Winnower in, might as well. Yeah, that seems like a lot of value that we're dropping. Now, notably, we're not doing a lot to quite stop our opponents until we hit that Void Winnower for sure. But that's a lot of value that we got as early as turn 2, right? So I'm definitely open to that sort of thing here with this deck. Let's see if there's any other stuff here. All right, so a second opening hand, a little bit more tame there for sure. We're looking at 1 land here, which is a little bit tough. And honestly, this is kind of one of the reasons I don't mind a 31 land hypothetical starting place for this deck, because look at a hand like this, you can still hit those 1 landers and get pretty screwed, and this deck wants mana, right? So it's not too crazy to consider that the case. Okay, this is our hypothetical 6 here, which I'm definitely into. We have Aggravated Assault in hand, which opens up a lot of combos pretty early. And then if our Urza Saga pops off relatively quick, we can get an early commander out. By turn 3 seems like the most reasonable turn we can guess by the way this opener is. Probably tuck the Atali because that's something we want to flip into for high value later on in the game. So turn 1, draw a card here, probably Urza Saga into the Mana Vault, get 1 counter on our Saga. Going into turn 2, we get a Voltaic Key here. Does Voltaic Key get us enough? No, I think because of the fact that we chose to sadly make the safer choice, which is go for the Urza Saga. If Voltaic Key was able to be enough, it would only still put us up to 6 mana, so we're still okay there. But yeah, this next turn we let the Urza Saga tick up 1. We can play the Voltaic Key for a single mana here, and then you can use the Mana Vault to untap the with the key here and get that Aggravated Assault down in case we want to potentially high roll into this next turn. Then on turn 3, our Urza Saga pops, we can float a colorless mana and probably go grab, I want to say a Soul Ring seems like the most reasonable grab here from this point. Now, hypothetically speaking, if we don't grab this Soul Ring, we play our land for turn, we still can go 3 mana untapped. So that's 5 mana right there between these two. So we could hypothetically just go into our commander if we don't grab the Soul Ring and grab something like a Vexing Bauble in case we're worried about our commander getting hit by a free interaction spell. So that's something worth noting too. But I also want to hypothetically open ourselves up to a possibility if we get some red mana that I want some extra mana to go for the Great Train Heist to take an extra combat, or go into this aggravated assault as activation, which is probably a little bit more pragmatic here, right? But let's just go and rip into our commander, play them from the command zone, and see what we get into as far as some nonsense is concerned. Just flip until we hit a creature here and see what it is. And sometimes, yeah, you're going to do stuff like this where you just flip over a bunch of these cards in your deck until you hit something. Of course, we once again get the Treasonous Ogre, but and once again, we were seeing a second scenario here where it does not matter that we get the Treasonous Ogre, because guess what? I'm just going to pay 15 life into this aggravated assault and do the whole thing again, right? Now, there's only so many times we can do that, but you know, we're going to go into it. And the reason I'm going for aggravated assault here instead of this Great Train Heist is that this can be countered off the stack and we lose essentially 12 life for nothing, whereas this is right here, we're ready to go again. So let's flip into our commander one more time, hit into an Ancient Copper Dragon. And the odds of us going infinite here on turn 3 are pretty high, because as long as the Ancient Copper Dragon does not continually low roll on its d20 over and over again, you are, you know, mathematically extremely likely to just turn this into an instant win, which is pretty dang sick. So as we can see, as I mentioned earlier, aggravated assault really turns this deck up to 11, but being able to curve into turn 2 aggravated assault into turn 3 commander for the it's just full going extra combats and winning, as long as you don't roll low on the d20, which we can simulate here on Moxfield. Let's roll that 20-sided dice. We got a 15. That is 3 free combats for us, and I feel like we probably win the game at that point. So GG's. And while here at the end of this video, I want to remind you that we do coaching here full-time at Comedian MTG. So if you're interested in taking a new brew, for example, in a new set like this in TMNT, or in any other set, or if you're interested in just taking that next step up in your cEDH game, feel free to reach out to me at comedianmtg@gmail.com, or any of the places in the link tree that are down in the description of this video. And we even have a sale going on right now for the month of February where you can get $10 off your one-on-one sessions with me. So it's actually a pretty great time to sign up and look into those coaching sessions. So if you're interested in that, feel free to reach out to me once again at comedianmtg@gmail.com, or any of the places in the link tree down below. Raph and Mikey version 1.0 is here, and it's playing pretty clean, honestly. I didn't really think that it was going to be doing as much nonsense as it is. Obviously, there's definitely a discrepancy between the power levels of, like, when you flip into your Ancient Coppers and when you flip into your Port Razors and Bloodthirsters, and then the difference when you hit that and like maybe a Value Atali, right? So there's definitely going to be some difference in power level there for these hits, but at the same time, you know, you always can cut some of these hits so that you're hitting gas every time. But honestly, I was worried about Treasonous Ogre, and every time we've hit that, it has basically won us the game on the spot. So pretty cool stuff there. And yeah, what do y'all think about this really weird, quirky little Ninja Turtle brew? Do y'all think it has legs in cEDH, or is it just maybe a high power deck that's trying too hard to fit into the cEDH shell, pun intended? Let us know in the comments down below, and thank you all for watching this episode. Thank you to everyone who sponsored this video, and most of all, thank you to Wizards of the Coast for making us an ambassador for this Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle set. This commander is definitely the one I'm most excited about from this set, and I'm hoping that it ends up being more cool than it is hope or cope, but we'll see as time goes on. I'm also thinking we could probably want to add like a Strionic Resonator to the sideboard here for more of that ability doubling. But all of that is said, and all of that aside, thank you all for watching this video, and we'll catch you next time. Peace.